I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this really thought-provoking meeting, which has been very challenging and intellectually engaging from start to finish. And I'd like to thank all of these people who have actually done all of the work that I'm going to be talking to you about today. So my main research interest is in the capacity for voluntary action, and particularly in the experience that we have of our own voluntary actions. So I'm going to really try and do three things in the next 30 minutes. First of all, I'm going to try to introduce you to the concept of a human sense of agency, a feeling of acting. I'm then going to talk about its social modulation. So I've just recently started working on how other people change our sense of agency. And there are a couple of results which have come up which may be relevant to syndrome E, which is why I'm primarily talking about social modulation, even though it's only a tiny part of my research program. And first of all, I'll talk about the mere presence of other agents having an effect on one's own sense of agency. And finally, I'll talk about something which is in a sense related to the Milgram experiments and the concept of only obeying orders. Okay, so what is a sense of agency? Well, let's start with a sort of a dictionary type definition. The sense of agency is the feeling, the subjective experience that I control my own actions, and by actions I mean bodily movements, contractions of muscles, and through those actions I can control events in the outside world. So Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher, famously asked, what is left over if I subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm? Now, one potential answer to him would be, Ludwig, the sense of agency is what's left over if we subtract the fact that my arm goes up from the fact that I raise my arm. So we have a distinctive experience of our own voluntary actions, and we use those actions to control the world, because I lift my arm to reach for the light switch, and then I can switch the lights on and off, and I can construct my environment. Now, one reason for thinking about sense of agency here is there's an intimate relationship between sense of agency and the concept of responsibility as it's used in a wider societal context. So the law, for example, is an institution, a societal institution which controls or regulates or influences our behavior. And an essential part of the legal concept of responsibility is that one voluntarily controls one's own action and one is aware of doing so. So most systems of law have something like a voluntary act condition. You're only responsible for your voluntary actions. You're not responsible for reflexes, sneezes, or spasms. And in addition, most systems of law have some sort of cognitive concept of what you need to understand in order to be an agent. So in my country, the ultimate legal control is exerted, or was exerted, by a bunch of unelected aristocrats called the House of Lords, and they make the ultimate decisions. And they decided in 1843 in the so-called McNaughton rules that in order to be capable of criminal responsibility and to appear as a normal agent in front of a court of law, you need to understand the nature and meaning of the act. You need to understand the nature and meaning of what you're doing. You need to have a sense of agency. So sense of agency is a subjective experience. It's a product of the motor systems of our brain, but a lot of our society seems to depend on it. Right? So it's a rather unusual, it perhaps plays a greater societal role than some of our other subjective experiences like visual awareness, for example. So one way to think about sense of agency in a process way is to consider that our actions begin with an intention, possibly you could call it also a goal, and we have a process which I'll call volition, which takes us from representations of goals to movements of the body. And then the critical point is that these movements typically aim at producing effects in the outside world. We make actions for a reason, and I use the concept of agency to refer to the linkage between what I do and what I make happen. There's an intimate relationship between volition and agency because I tend to have a sense of agency over those actions that I intended to produce. So how does society figure at all in the concept of individual agency? Well, there are several ways in which particularly social psychologists have been interested in modulations of individual sense of agency in societal contexts. So the most obvious one is ambiguity. When lots of people are acting, what did I do and what did you do and who actually made the action? So it's well known, for example, that in firing squads, it's traditional that one of these rifles is given a blank bullet, right? And presumably the reason for that is so that everybody who has to do this job can at least entertain the possibility that they did not fire the fatal shot. So it's interesting that that activity of execution by firing squad has built into it. It's exploited the fact that we're sometimes ambiguous about our own agency because we don't know whether what happened was a result of me doing it, or you doing it, or you. And in fact, the same sort of concept lies at the heart of the self-recognition experiment, which is one of the most established ways that we have of studying the sense of agency. And it involves a situation where you're looking at a screen. It's in fact projected via a mirror here. And on the screen, what you see is a hand movement, which might be your hand movement, made behind this baffle here and relayed via video, or it might be the movement of another person, and there's a video switch here which can connect either of these two cameras to the screen and thus show you either your own hand or somebody else's hand. And it's a little bit like mirror self-recognition. The question is that your hand? Did you do that? So agency ambiguity is an important thing that we get in multi-agent situations. Another very common social modulation of agency is the so-called bystander effect or bystander apathy. So this is sort of industrial scale in social psychology. The question is, when there's somebody who's needs your help, why does one always think somebody else will do it? All right? So those are the sorts of modulations of sense of agency that we have. What I want to do now is introduce you to some very new experiments which are not published at all, in which we've been interested in a third possible mechanism. I think it's different from self-recognition and bystander effect, which is looking at whether the mere presence of others can change your sense of agency when you do act, even when it's completely unambiguous about whether what happens is done by you or done by somebody else. So it's some kind of social aura or context effect. And we did this within the context of a risk-reward-based decision-making game, which is similar to many other games that you've heard about. It's a little bit like the balloon analog risk task, but it involves a marble which is rolling down this slope. And you start off the start of the experiment with loads of money. You've got an endowment, and your job is to not lose money, right? So you're trying to not lose money. And you can not lose money by pressing a button to stop the marble going down the slope. And depending on where the marble is when you press the button, you will be able to not lose a tiny amount of money by taking the risky decision of stopping the marble at the very end, or you can take a safer decision of stopping the marble earlier and you lose a lot more money. So the bad outcome is the safe choice, and the best outcome is the risky choice, and the terrible outcome is if you press the button too late and the marble falls off the end and it shatters and you lose 72 points. So that's a sort of standard risk-reward type game. And after you've pressed the button and you've got your points, we're going to ask you explicitly, using an analog scale, how much control do you think you had over what you've just done? How much in control did you feel on that individual trial? So that's fine. That's just like a standard risk-reward game. We're going to add another set of trials, which are intermixed randomly, where you're playing with another person. Okay, you're playing with another person. And let me first of all describe who this other person is. This other person is somebody who you meet at the start of the experiment. You sign the consent forms together. They then go off to another room. And they're represented as an avatar who is shown at the start of every trial. So at the start of every trial, you're told that you're playing with Bill, or on this trial, you're playing alone, and it's randomized whether you're playing with this other person or playing alone. So in fact, of course, you're playing against a computer, but you do meet the other player when you come into the experiment. So there's no sort of formal, obvious reason to suspect that you're not playing with another person. I don't think this is a deeply deceptive experiment. So the interesting thing about the other person is that you have exactly the same contingencies and outcomes for stopping the marble falling down the slope when you're playing with Bill, but there's also the possibility that Bill in fact presses the button, and Bill presses the button right at the end, and if he presses the button and acts for you, then you lose nothing at all. So the perfect outcome, which is available in the social condition but not in the individual condition, is that the other person could do it all for you and then you don't lose any money at all. That's the best outcome. Now, what we're actually going to do is we're going to compare the sense of agency on trials where you press the button, but the other person was also present and therefore could have, with the sense of agency where you press the button and only you were in the game and you knew that the other person wasn't involved. So you've got two contexts. One is an individual context, one's a social context. You're pressing buttons and you're getting good or bad rewards in both cases. And just to clarify the design features here, there's clear evidence that another agent sometimes acts instead of you because you meet them at the start of the experiment and sometimes they save you money. The other person's actions actually change the distribution of outcomes because there's this possibility of this golden outcome where somebody else acts for you, and we're going to analyze explicit ratings of control after each trial, but only for those trials where you actually do something. So let's look first of all at this right-hand plot here. This is the position on the slope at which you press the button to stop the marble. So this is an indication about whether the social context of the other person potentially acting changes your behavior or not. And here in dark gray, we have the condition where you're acting alone, and you press the button when the marble is 80% of the way down the slope, and you press the button significantly later when the other person is also present. And we think that what this is that you're hoping that the other guy is going to press it for you, so you delay your own action. So there's a behavioral change from the social possibility of another person acting. The more important thing for us is the agency rating. So these are the VAS ratings of how much in control you feel over the outcome you've got, and you feel more in control when you act alone than when the other person is also present. And we're only including those trials here where you press the button and you see that the marble stops. So there's no ambiguity about agency. It's just that the possibility that the other person was on the horizon and could have acted seems to dilute your sense of individual control over what you do when you yourself act. So there's some kind of contextual dilution. You can also do this with EEG, and you can measure a component called the feedback-related negativity. So this is a component, a negative-going component, which appears after you present an outcome or a feedback signal. And what we can see is that the feedback-related negativity is reduced. In other words, it is more positive. Notice we're plotting positive down here. It's more positive when other people are present in the acting together condition, shown in the dashed line, compared to acting alone. So the way that you would interpret this within a classic sort of cognitive control EEG context is that there's a social reduction of the neural processing of the outcomes of one's own actions. So when other people are in the frame and might act, even though it's obvious that they don't on this particular trial, I somehow don't process the outcomes of my own actions as much. So just to conclude from this particular part of the talk, this particular experiment, the mere presence of other potential agents seems to changes the overall distribution of what might happen. And that's a little bit like real life, okay? So other people are pretty unpredictable. If other people are in the frame, the reward landscape is different. And this seems to reduce the sense of agency that we feel over what we do ourselves. So in that sense, perhaps our sense of agency does correctly track the way that events are different when other agents are in the frame. What's the mechanism? Well, of course, we don't know. This is the first experiment on this that we've done. But one thing that we're entertaining is the idea that there's some kind of counterfactual thinking going on, and that in groups or in social situations, there may be some sort of counterfactual thinking about what other people might do and how that might change the situation. So maybe one reason why you feel reduced sense of agency in social situations is because they tend to be very dynamic. Stuff changes fast when other people are around because you've no real idea what they're going to do. And I'd just like to emphasize one important point about previous sort of social psychological work on action. Almost all previous work has focused on whether people act. So the question in the bystander effect is, why is it that you watch one person stabbing another and you do not intervene? Why do you not act? And very little of that work has considered sort of subjective experience. And we're quite interested in the idea that not only do social situations reduce our factual action frequency, but they might also reduce our experience of our agency when we do act. We might not feel that our actions are quite the same in social situations and in individual situations. And I think that may be related to this idea of flat affect, which we haven't talked about much in the context of Syndrome E, but I'm going to come back to. Okay, I now want to talk very briefly about the idea of only obeying orders and the possibility that our sense of agency and our autonomous voluntary control of our action, according to some people, is reduced in hierarchical situations where social structures make us do things, that we're socially constrained. Now, there are a number of situations where we really want people not to choose for themselves and we really need them to follow orders. Right? So just obeying orders is sometimes really good. So in the military situation, we really expect a soldier not to think too much for themselves and to do what they're told. That's important. We can't really have an army where people say, oh, I don't really feel like that today. Sorry, no, I'm not interested. That really wouldn't work. And I think it's not just the army, although the army is the best example. There's also things like air traffic control. You really want to believe that the person who's in control of the plane that you're on is following rigid rules and isn't actually thinking for themselves too freely. They may be able to use a little bit of creativity if they have to find a solution which isn't in the rule book, but most of the time you don't want them being too creative. So these are situations where we have to ask about responsibility, and we have to really acknowledge, I think, that in a complex society like human society, responsibility does move around from one person to another. There are specific situations which we regulate and we mandate and we actually approve, like military command, where we really acknowledge that one person is not responsible, the soldier is not responsible for their actions, because by the chain of command, the officer and the general and the field marshal and, in a democratic society, ultimately the elected politician is really responsible for those actions. And that's fine. So we have this concept that sometimes the responsibility lies not with the person who gives orders, rather than with the person who follows them. Now, of course, this is exactly the topic of the Milgram experiment. I don't need to go into that in detail. We've heard about it lots in the last couple of days. The point that I'd just like to make about Milgram is Milgram only had one dependent variable of interest, and it was whether people would do what they were told or not. He was really interested in whether people will comply. And what we thought was interesting, at least to ask, is, okay, most people obey orders, most people comply, but do people who comply feel a sense of agency over the bad outcomes of their own action, or do they not? And perhaps this is relevant because maybe the reason why people will obey coercive orders is because coercive instruction somehow removes this sense of voluntary choice or action selection, and maybe it leads to a reduced subjective experience of your own agency. So that's really quite sort of striking and quite shocking, because the normal reaction to the claim, I was only obeying orders, is quite correctly a total skepticism. It's really easy to say, oh, it wasn't me, I was only obeying orders. So we need to be very, very suspicious of people who say that, and we wanted to ask whether people actually feel that, okay? So we did an experiment which is a little bit similar in some ways to the Milgram experiment, but it's different in some other pretty important ways. It's also got strong similarities with the experiment that Ray described this morning by Molly Crockett. We've got two participants who are giving each other visibly painful electric shocks. So here's an electric shock stimulator. This person in this particular trial is the agent because she is going to deliver a painful electric shock to somebody who is the, quote, victim, unquote. Note quote marks, right? So in the paper, we never use the word victim without quote marks because this person's not a real victim. They're playing the role of the victim in this experiment. The critical point is that this electric shock machine does actually deliver electric shocks, and the agent does press the button and gives an electric shock to this person, in return for which they get a small amount of money, right? So as always in these experiments, you need to have some reason why people will do horrible things. Money is one reason why people do horrible things, both in this experiment and outside it. Now, so the two people are delivering electric shocks to one another. There's one other important thing, which is that halfway through the experiment, these roles reverse. So the methods are at least fair. They're not nice, but they're at least fair, and they're totally transparent because you know that you're delivering an electric shock to the other person because both of the people have had their pain thresholds calibrated in public in advance, and the shocks are calibrated to produce a visible flinch. So you can see exactly, as the agent, you can see exactly what you're doing to the victim, and you know that the victim is going to be able to do exactly the same back to you later, right? So there's no asymmetric power relation between the agent and the victim over the long run, whereas in the Milgram experiment there is, right? The Milgram experiment, first of all, never actually delivered painful shocks. It was based on deception, which I didn't want to include in this experiment. I wanted to include actual sensory experience. And in the Milgram experiment, it was asymmetric in the sense that the participant in the experiment shocked or appeared to shock the confederate, although they didn't actually shock them at all, and there was no reversal of that relationship. Okay, so the people are blocked in taking turns of being agent and the victim, and they're delivering genuine shocks, and they can see what they're doing, and they get a small amount of money when they deliver the shock. We wanted to study coercion, so we have a coercive condition in which the experimenter says, before some trials, you must give a shock to her on this trial. So the experimenter says, for this trial, you have to shock her. And then on other trials, the experimenter will say, on this trial, please press another button, and you must not shock her. So there are two response buttons, and the experimenter gives coercive instructions about giving a shock by pressing one button or not giving a shock by pressing another. And we compare that to a free choice condition where the experimenter looks out of the window and plays no real part in the proceedings at all, and the agent can freely choose whether to deliver a shock to the victim and thus gain a little bit of money, or not to deliver a shock to the victim and thus not get any money. So we've basically got a 2-by-2 design where you're either coerced or you freely choose, and you either administer a shock or you don't administer a shock. I'll summarize the design again in a minute. What I now want to talk about is how we're going to measure sense of agency. So here we're going to use an implicit measure based on time perception. If you really want to understand people's sense of agency, it's not a good idea to ask them directly, right? Lots and lots of people go to a court of law and they say, I'm not guilty, right? And you probably shouldn't believe everybody who says, I'm not guilty. It's not a good idea to ask for explicit judgments of agency. We did in the first experiment. In the second experiment, rather than asking explicitly, did you do that? Or tell me about how you did that, we're going to use a measure based on time perception. It's long established in the history of psychology that asking people when they experience things is quite informative about the processes that construct their experience. And we found out many years ago that when you make an action which produces an effect, a beep, 250 milliseconds later in the outside world, people don't actually perceive their actions and the beeps happening at the time that they really do, or even at the time that they would appear to happen if they occurred alone. People perceive the action as shifted towards the beep, and the beep has shifted back towards the action. So people perceive the temporal interval between what they do and what they make happen as temporally compressed and as shorter than it really is. It's exactly what David Hume said about temporal contiguity being important for causation. There's a kind of perceptual compression that happens, which is a good proxy for our experience of agency, because it's entirely absent in the case of involuntary movements. These are involuntary movements produced by stimulating the brain with a transcranial magnetic stimulator. So there's something about I decided to press the button and I decided to make a beep or give her a shock or whatever, which produces this temporal compression between what I do and what I experience to happen as a consequence. And we're going to do that in this Milgram-style experiment, because we're going to ask people to press the button, and it's going to be followed by a tone, and the tone is always happening simultaneously with the electric shock. Okay? So the tone always happens, the shock sometimes happens, but they always happen simultaneously. And in this particular version of this binding measure, we're going to vary the interval between action and tone, and we're simply going to ask you by absolute reckoning to say, how long did you think it was between pressing the button and hearing the tone? 200 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds, 400 milliseconds? And we can do that in these 4 different conditions. So we've got the coercion condition, where you're either told on each trial you must give a painful shock to this person, so shock and tone co-occur, or you must make the other response, which will just make the tone occur and no painful shock, and then a free choice condition, where a free choice block of trials, where you choose for yourself whether to live with a painful shock and get money or not. And we're going to record EEG while this happens. So let's just look at, first of all, at this measure of sense of agency, this experience of, I made that happen, this temporal compression between what you do and what you experience. So what we've got across the x-axis here is the actual interval between pressing the button and hearing the tone. Remember that the shock happens at the same time. So we've actually got 200, 500, or 800 millisecond delays between what you do and what happens. And here we've got people's estimated delays just by giving us a number, like I think that was 400 milliseconds. I think that was about 626. And we hypothesize that a low estimated interval corresponds to a strong sense of agency because of this binding, and a high interval estimate corresponds to a low sense of agency. So what you can see is that the coercive block of trials in light gray here always produces higher interval estimates, longer subjective delays, than the block of trials where you freely choose to punish or not punish, or to shock or not shock the victim. So the actual way that you experience your own action and its outcome seems to vary according to whether the experimenter tells you that you have to do it or whether you decide for yourself to do it. So the gap between those 2 curves corresponds, we think, to a reduction in the sense of agency when you follow coercive orders. When somebody else makes you do something, you actually seem to experience differently the relationship between what you do, because you're told to, and the subsequent outcome. You seem to feel a reduced sense of agency. Coercion reduces this implicit measure of sense of agency relative to free choice. Now that's really quite interesting, because it opens up what to my... Oh, let me first of all tell you the other results before the interpretation. So the other result that we have is if we measure the brain response to the tone, remember there's always a tone after you press the button, we can measure the auditory N1, which is a relatively early EEG component for the brain processing of the tone. And we can see that it is suppressed. There's less brain processing of the tone when you're coerced in dark blue to pressing the button and causing the tone and possible shock than when you freely choose to do so in light blue. So coercion reduces the neural processing of outcomes. Now, one thing which was completely null in our experiment is whether the person actually got a shock or not. On some of the trials, the experimenter made you deliver a shock, and on some of the trials, the experimenter coerced you into pressing a different button which didn't deliver a shock, and that had no effect on the sense of agency or on the neural response to the tone. So what we're getting here is a change in the sense of agency which is due to the way you choose, not due to what happens. It's due to the context of whether I freely select or I'm made to do something rather than the result that I get. So this is all tricky, but it seems to me that it leads to the rather really unpleasant, rather scary conclusion. So we know that people often claim reduced responsibility. So this idea that I was only obeying orders, please let me off, that's a very common claim. I had no choice. Our data opens the rather, to me, scary possibility that people might actually experience less responsibility when they're coercively made to do something compared to when they voluntarily choose to do it. So the actual primary experience they have of their own action and its outcome is subject to a strong social modulation by a coercive other, and seems to be a change in a basic sensory experience which we can measure implicitly and which looks as though it points towards an actual reduced feeling of responsibility. Now, one potential upshot of that is this may explain why people obey bad orders. Maybe the reason why so many of us in Milgram-type experiments will obey bad orders is because there's something in our brains which can make us feel less responsible for what happens when we do obey. So we may be responsive, we may be prone to obedience because we are able to discount outcomes of actions made under coercion. And I think what this means is that societies need to very carefully manage the sense of agency with which we bring people up, if you like, and we certainly need to manage carefully who we allow to give orders, to whom we attribute responsibility, because it looks like there might be something in our minds which means that when we are subject to coercive instructions, our sense of responsibility can rapidly change. So what does this mean for syndrome E? Well, I've talked about the sense of agency. You can summarize the sense of agency linguistically, although I think it is pre-linguistic, but you can summarize it linguistically with the proposition, I did that. And the experience of I did that, I think, is a basic low-level sensory motor experience, and it underlies the whole of our concept of responsibility, and it's hard to see how we'd have anything like a modern society without it. So I think it's a key mental state. And it's normally sensitive to the moral and emotional valence of outcomes. We haven't talked much about that today, but there are other pieces of data showing, for example, a very strong self-serving bias in sense of agency. So when you do something and it has a very positive outcome, you tend to feel a strong sense of agency. When you do something and it has a very negative outcome, you tend to feel a low sense of agency. But sense of agency, as well as being sort of subject to moral and emotional valence, it's also vulnerable to social downregulation. And we've heard that syndrome E is associated with flat affect, a failure to apprehend or take on the significance of one's own actions. And I think this is an area where sense of agency may have some comment. And I think we need to ask about the neural mechanisms which underlie the capacity for the agency centers in the brain to be so subject to social modulation. And we need to think about ways that we can protect society against destructive group behaviors which somehow co-opt our slightly vulnerable sense of agency. Thank you very much for your attention.